days. What does it mean for taxi drivers? I mean, people have been freaking out about Uber and those guys. What does it mean for taxi drivers? Do you need taxi drivers anymore? If you can just have a fleet of cars driving around the place? No. So that's one vertical gone. Don't need them anymore. That's true. Again, I can tell where your interests lie. So don't need taxi drivers anymore. How about public transport? What does public transport look like? The idea of needing trains? Well, that's pretty archaic. Because all you do is you book a cab or book one of these things on your phone, and effectively what happens is it'll dynamically route the nearest car past your house, and you'll carpool with other people. And it can do large-scale optimization behind the scenes to work that out. It's okay. Sorry? Possibly. Highly likely, because it's going to be far easier to pack 4 or 5, actually 6 people technically into a car. I don't know. Would you be happy to save $25,000, $40,000 a year by not having to buy a car? That's a lot of extra money in your pocket. You don't have to pay upkeep. You don't have to pay registration. And all you have to do is pay for the miles you actually travel. Interesting idea. Of course, that means that the car salesman have got to go, which is no big loss. But you know. Okay, so that's you know, so far we've lost taxi drivers and car salesmen. Apologies if anyone's a taxi driver here, but these are not industries which I'm terribly concerned about in the grand scheme of things. How about logistics? The vast majority of freight around the place is transported by truck. And about 40% of the cost of a logistics operation is in labor. It's in the truck drivers driving these things around, which we don't need anymore. So that's another trench gone. Just don't need truck drivers anymore. How about insurance? Anyone here in insurance? You don't need insurance. The whole idea of car insurance and personal motor insurance, don't really need it anymore in the long term. So progressively, just that introduction of the driverless car, we're slicing entire sections of society out who are no longer able to be gainfully employed, and realistically, probably don't have the necessary skill sets to be able to go into new areas. And again, it's not being enabled because all of a sudden we've magically transformed the way artificial intelligence works. We've just got enough data that we can actually mine and solve local problems quite effectively. Amazon, I'll come back to Amazon now. Amazon was a leader in this space. They got really smart early because if you dig into it, one of the things that triggered back at about 97-ish, 96, 97? No, it was couldn't have been that far back. I can't remember when. It's in the book, you can read. But they had a huge problem. It would have been about 2007, actually. Huge problem with their logistics. One Thanksgiving. Basically what happened was Thanksgiving was a huge time for them. They had hit a certain level of scale in terms of shipping and everything else. They lost a shipment in one of their warehouses. Okay, so they, the orders were coming in, they couldn't find these products. Because they couldn't find the products, orders were getting backed up all over the place. And unfortunately, the problem was it happened in one of their highest demand products. It was actually, believe it or not, it was a set of Jigglypuff dolls. They lost a pallet of Jigglypuff dolls in one of their warehouses, and they couldn't find it. Now, you leave some coins behind the couch, it takes you 5 minutes to find it. This warehouse was about the size, I think it was about 6 to 8 football fields big. And I kid, this is not an exaggeration. They had to launch an expedition party to try and find this thing, and it took them 3 days in that warehouse to track this pallet down. And they realized they had to get a lot smarter around how they actually managed inventory. And they started turning more and more to data analysis, logistics, and dynamic stock optimization. Today, how many of you know that Amazon has taken out a patent? They took out a patent in December last year to ship you your goods before you had ordered. 2 people. 3. That's pretty much, that's right. 4. A few people. Pretty cool though. So they worked out a way to ship you your goods before you've even thought about buying them. And again, that's not because they're clairvoyant or prescient. It's because they understand how to mine their information. And they can do stuff that would just be totally disruptive, totally mind-blowing. Basically what they did is they worked out, again, that they ship enough products around the country that even though they can't tell where the product is necessarily going to go to a specific household address, they know that in a given catchment area, they're going to ship a certain number of these products every single day. Okay, so regardless, think 50 Shades of Grey, that kind of stuff. Stuff that was in high demand, high volume, high transactional. They didn't know where it was going to go, but they knew that in a given neighborhood area, they were going to ship 50 of these things every single day. What they worked out was they could forecast that. Now, the key to the puzzle behind the scenes when you pick it apart, everyone's seen, or most people have seen Amazon's drones. They're trying to get through the FAA, flying around the place. So Amazon's got these drones. They're basically unmanned drones that they sent up a flare to the FAA late last year, I think it was? Yeah, it would have been late last year, saying basically, this isn't regulated yet, and we are going to be launching these things around the US in the next 2 to 3 years. The technology is not yet fully baked, but what we want to do is have these things delivering goods across the US. So basically, you order your product, and then at some point in the future, this thing flies into your house, drops it on your desk, and then buzzes back out again. True story. What they worked out, and this is the secret sauce behind the whole thing. If they can work out how many goods are going to ship in a particular area, they can start those products in the supply chain before anyone's ordered them. They can have them go through the logistics, go through the whole point, hit the distribution center, get picked up by a drone, and then dynamically update the address while the drone's in flight going out to that neighborhood. So think real-time, just-in-time logistics management to the household. Now that, again, if you think about the disruption, that is phenomenally disruptive. Everybody in the bricks and mortar space has been worried about Amazon's constant encroachment on their areas. But Amazon's biggest weakness was always that you couldn't get the product in the same day. If you really wanted something now, you had to go to a bricks and mortar store. Amazon will do it, and I love Amazon's brilliant with this. People pay, you know Amazon Prime? Basically you pay $80 a year, and they give you access to their free media, which is great. But for $80 a year, they promise to ship you stuff for free, effectively, if it's coming out of their warehouses. So they can sell you an $80 product on a promise that you may use this at some point. That's how good that's how powerful the value proposition is. You don't get anything for it technically. We didn't for ages until they started streaming stuff on the Kindle Fire. But with Amazon Prime, and with the ability to ship this product to you and get the drones delivered before you start it in the supply chain, before you've actually ordered it, all of a sudden, you no longer have to make a decision about whether you go to a bricks and mortar store and get it now, or order it from Amazon and get it tomorrow. You can actually have it faster by ordering it off Amazon than you could possibly ever get by going to a bricks and mortar store. Potentially, you could have sub-hour delivery. Forget about same day. That's disruption. That's terrifying for a retailer, because all of a sudden Amazon's got a cost advantage, they've got a stock advantage, and they have a time advantage. And again, enabled by information and analytics. I'll give you one more example. And I can't say who this is, but I did some work with the Justice Department a while ago. Now, we worked out that the question was, can you accurately predict someone's likelihood of recidivism? So recommitting a crime. So they've got lots of information about these people, they've got lots of histories. We kicked it around and we decided to try and work out, can you actually model that? And the reality is that you actually can. So we weren't looking at high violence crimes like murder or assault or anything else like that. We were looking at drink driving. So given someone's background, can you accurately or reasonably accurately predict the odds of them actually reoffending and going out and drink driving again? And we worked out that you could. Now, that creates tremendously interesting questions. Has anyone seen Minority Report? That's not fiction. Given enough information, given the right information, you can do that. Ethically, is that right? But it's accurate. And what happens if the person kills someone when they drive? It wasn't 100% accurate. We couldn't predict with 100% certainty. But on the balance of probabilities, it was accurate enough that it posed a lot of interesting questions. And then it leads to a question, is that something you put in front of a judge or not? Now, they haven't done anything with this yet, for obvious reasons. But that's the kind of ethical questions that we start getting into. So that in a snapshot is a picture of the future. We have entire tranches of society that, thanks to automation, big data, and analytics, no longer are relevant because we can automate that whole process. And increasingly, the scope of where that fits is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I can't claim credit for this. There's other economists who have been looking into this, but by rough estimate, probably about 40% of the labor force, roughly. We've also got situations where the whole idea of what we consider ethical and appropriate kind of gets all tossed up into the air, and we have to start asking, what does this mean if we have the ability to predict this kind of stuff? Because again, this isn't hypothetical, it's not science fiction, it's actually doable today. And from a hands-on perspective, I can vouch, it's doable. So this is, when I say that change is enormous, I may have started talking about iPads and Kodak and those guys, but this is the big picture of what the world looks like. And again, this isn't stuff that's happening off in the future, it's stuff that's happening today and is increasingly happening. So, the interesting question for me out of all of this is, one, if you look at it from a personal perspective, a commercial perspective, or a public policy perspective, the world has changed so much that we can't keep doing the same things over and over and over again. They don't work. If you're in competition, you will go out of business. It's pretty much that simple. The time frame between finding out that your business model no longer works and actually going out of business is getting increasingly short. BlackBerry got disrupted in 3 years. It took 3 years for BlackBerry to go off a cliff, and they were the smartphone manufacturer. And it's getting shorter, if you follow what I mean. Public policy's got the same challenges. So if you look at OECD economies across the globe, we've got a massive and growing problem. We've got a total imbalance between taxation, revenues, and expenditures everywhere. Now, this is not a Tony Abbott brand pitch here. The reality is that every OECD nation has declining growth rates. Okay, so every nation is getting increasingly stacked towards age population. OECD nations specifically, very different in India, China, and so on. The problem is, as the population gets older, tax revenues decline because people start wanting to retire, they want to stop working, they want to start spending more time at leisure, and they get older and they can't necessarily work. On the other side, the demand for healthcare goes up because as you get older, you have more problems, so the cost of public health increases as well. Now, the problem is this is not something that you can flick a switch and solve. Back of the envelope calculations, this is really back of the envelope. I am an economist by background, so trust me, this is really back of the envelope. But broadly speaking, in order to be able to balance the OECD nations' budgets, and this is not unique to Australia, this is Australia, New Zealand, the US, everywhere. In order to keep the budgets balanced and keep the economy sustainable, there's really only one of 3 things to do. One is to slash everything across the board everywhere. So start talking about no public education, no public health, eliminate defense, or make enormous cuts to services across the board. Second option is to decrease the requirements for immigration and start reboosting up the population, or otherwise encouraging everyone to have 4 kids somehow. Basically push up the birth rate again to be able to create a new tax pool. Or the third option is to somehow work a way, and to give you an idea of the scale of this, if they want to be able to balance budgets, it works out to around about a 4 to 5% compound budget reduction per annum for the next 50 years. That's the level of efficiency gain that needs to happen. So in the public sector, if you look at the disruption on that side, standard budget cutting doesn't work. Either we create a vastly different society and completely change the way what the public sector means, or we've got to become that much smarter and change the game. New Zealand's doing this kind of stuff at the moment. So I mean, have a look around John Key's reform program. They've been doing a lot of stuff around using and measuring forward liability and investing in specific areas to try and reduce long-term exposure through the use of analytics, and it's working. It's significantly working. They've been able to strip out about $4 billion of long-term exposure over the next 30 years. So the key thing, though, is whether you're in the private sector, the public sector, the personal level, or anywhere else, everything is being driven by our ability to use information and leverage it for advantage. Cool. So I'll give you how many of you work in either a big data space or dealing with big data, or well, actually, first question: how many of you have heard of big data? Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted. How many of you are actually working with big data? A few people. Yeah. Okay. Actually, quite a few. All right. I want to give you an example here. That is a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Does anyone see anything interesting about that picture? Sorry? Any workers? Yeah, that's true. Is there anything else? A little bit bendy. Anyone see what I'm talking about? That's a wing. So the 787 Dreamliner is an example of modern engineering. Okay, it's a fully modern engineered plane. Costs around about, I think, from memory, around about 20 million to buy. 25 million something, which is a problem because they're currently selling for about 10. So they got a bit of work to do yet. But the key thing, well, first of all, if you're ever worried about turbulence in a plane, don't be. That's the kind of flex that these planes get. The interesting thing about the 787 Dreamliner, though, is not its physical engineering. The interesting thing is that that thing is effectively a flying data center. Okay, every time that plane takes off and lands again, from its sensors inside the plane, generates around about a terabyte of data. Every return trip. Now, what that means in terms of how that data gets used, how many of you know that General Electric no longer sells engines? They lease them. Few people. GE got out of selling engines a few years ago because basically what happened was the airline industry, the airlines, hated maintenance. Maintenance was a huge cost to them. And there were problems with unions, there were problems all over the place. They just hated maintenance generally. And so GE said, well, you know, what we could do, I guess, if you really wanted to, what we could do is lease you the engine, and then we could take care of it. And, you know, we could try and save you some money around the place. And the airlines went, geez, that's a brilliant idea. Done! So they signed the deal. What GE did was start building more and more sensors into their engines and start analyzing the usage patterns in the engines. Also started analyzing the fuel consumption patterns. Because they also part pay fuel costs in this. So if they had a Singapore Airlines flight going from Sydney to LA, and they hit the headwinds that sometimes come up, they could actually work out for the next plane, which might be a Qantas flight, that, hey, maybe that plane shouldn't fly through that area, and there should actually be a slight reroute recommended from the doctor, or maybe we can recalibrate the engine's running parameters so it becomes more efficient, doesn't stress itself so much, do a whole bunch of other stuff in flight based on multiple data feeds. And by doing that, they actually turned the engine leasing business into a tremendously profitable business for them. At which point all the airlines said, why are you ripping us off? You're making so much money out of this. It's that machine data which is creating the next boost in information. Now, it's only a matter of time, and this isn't an exaggeration, it's only a matter of time until every single seat on a plane is actually sending out a sensor about how your flight is going. So if you're getting too hot, you can have personal climate control. It'll work out, are you too hot, are you too cold? Maybe if you're shuffling around a lot or uncomfortable, one of the attendants can come by and check and see how you're doing if you're in business class. They can, this is what we're going towards. Now that's kind of interesting. It's all right. But realistically, how many of you are in the market for a $20 million plane? If you are, Boeing would like to talk to you. It's across the board though, and this is the thing. Everywhere you look, every single low-cost device is being built with this information. Does anyone jog? Some of you got a jog. Have you played with Zombies Run on the iPhone or Android? Yeah? Cool. Great, it's a great app. If you haven't done it, if you run and you don't, you've got to download this. Basically what happens is it's like a podcast, except it's linked into your iPhone or your Android to be able to track where you're running, how fast you're running, and periodically the zombies chase you. It's great fun. But that's now, that everybody remember Polar? Remember you used to have to pay like $600 for a heart rate monitor? That's just now like a $40 Bluetooth thing that you kind of buy as a short, just randomly decide to pick one up. Integrates with your phone. All that technology is just built into your phone, as a matter of course. Motion control, altitude, GPS, stuff that was really expensive 6 years ago. Really expensive. Anyone know the top things at the top? Anyone following Disney? Magic Band?
Unfortunately, yes.
Have you just been to for it? Oh, yeah. Okay, Magic Band, it's genius. It's cool. It's very cool. It's what they're going to do with it's even cooler. Basically, what it is it's an RFID chip built into a bracelet. You get them personalized with your own Disney characters, and they come with your kids' names on them. So if you stay at a Disney resort in Florida, you check in, and you've got the option. I think it's mandatory or it's optional.
Mandatory now.
Mandatory, yeah. You get a box of these on your bed, and you come into your room, and your kids are all excited to rip open the box, and they whack on the bracelets. It's great. It's key to your room, so you don't need a room key anymore. So you just walk over and open the door, and your room opens. Also key to your credit card. Which is great. They've actually copped a lot of flack over the last few months because they didn't put down spending limits on there. So I think there was a lot of very happy kids running around. A lot of toys. But the interesting thing about that, they've wired the whole park. They've got sensors all over the park. They've also got a key to your personal identity. They can work out where you are, they can work out what you like, they know where you stay, they know when you eat, they know when you go into the gym, because it's also key into the gym. They know if you go to shows, if you're a member of the loyalty program, they know who you like, they know who your kids like, they know the characters your kids like. If you are a high VIP, in principle, we're not doing this yet, but in principle, they can actually reroute key Disney mascots to a specific area of the park and let them know who they're talking to in real time across the park. They can tell you that a restaurant is full on your phone. So if you're wandering past a restaurant, they can work out that actually that restaurant's already at capacity. You are a VIP. We know that you like New Orleans food. If you keep going down the road for another 2 minutes and turn left, there's actually a number of seats there waiting for you. When they talk about having the happiest place on earth, they really mean it. That's the goal. And that's about probably about $1.20 worth of technology. Forgetting the network, we'll just ignore the RFID network, but the bracelet itself is about $1.20. Same thing with the Leap Band, which is a horrible name down the bottom. Sounds like something that you go to a surgeon for. It's for your kids. It's like a Fitbit for your kids. Do you ever remember Tamagotchi? It's basically a Tamagotchi tied into a motion sensing device to get your kids off the couch, which is just bizarre. The one on the bottom right is for your car. Interfaces with your car wirelessly. So it's everywhere. And all this information that's being generated is there to be analyzed and to do stuff with. Change the way companies interact with people. Change the whole idea. I mean, why do you need a personal physician? You know, if you can work out, cost of sequencing the genomes dropped from, I think it was around about $100,000 about 8 to 10 years ago, down to about $8,000 now. No, sorry, it's even lower than that. You can get yourself scanned for Neanderthal genes for I think under $100. True story. So, you know, the idea of personalized medicine, do you need a GP? Really? At this point, it's getting close to the point where the systems themselves are able to work out negative drug interactions. If you have large-scale analysis of adverse drug reactions across the entirety of the population, monitored through HealthKit or Android's equivalent, linked into your medical profile, the whole idea of personalized medicine on your phone is within 5 years. Again, just for sheer analytical capacity and big data. So that's the world. That's the big picture. From a private sector perspective, so let's talk a little bit about competitive differentiation. This stuff's not new, you know, in terms of being able to use it for differentiation. How many people have a stats background? Out of curiosity. Do you remember students distribution? Take it back first year stats? Do you know where that came from? Did you do the background on actually where it was created?
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. William Gossett was working at Guinness. And this is hilarious now. He had a problem where he was dealing with such low sample sizes that the medical literature and the epidemiology statistics couldn't handle his small sample sizes. So he had to come up with a new distribution to be able to model basically the effect of model population differences. Now, he wasn't doing it because he was doing it for research purposes. He was doing it because he was trying to maximize crop yield for beer production. So he was trying to work out how do I maximize barley yield, given the right fertilizers and the right testing regimes, the right watering patterns, how do I do the same for grains? He was trying to work out how to maximize beer production. And it was, for Guinness, it was great. You know, they did allow him to publish it, but he couldn't publish it under his own name, so he published it as Students Distribution, which is where we know it today. But for them, it gave him a huge cost advantage at the time. So it's not like analytics is new in terms of driving differentiation. It's been around for a long time. Now, on the big data front, and again, pretty quickly, big data is kind of, to me, it's a very uninteresting thing. As far as a technology problem, it has been solved. The biggest problem around the place is that people are still wondering what to do about big data. The reality is that if Facebook can store 350 petabytes of data, I don't think most of us have a real problem in terms of solving the technology problem, if you get what I mean. The interesting thing, though, is that as far as big data goes, with everything I've mentioned in terms of machine data and everything else, it's often, you often hear people say that about 80% of the world's data has been generated in the last 3 years. Yeah? You've heard statistics kind of like that. They vary. Depends on who's saying them. It's kind of, it's a great thing about statistics. You can always make up your own. The interesting thing, though, is that 80% of the world's data has always been generated in the last 3 years, going back to the 1960s, when we first started digitizing information. It's an exponential curve. And you know, everyone's heard of Moore's Law? You know, the number of resistors on a CPU doubles roughly every 18 months. Same one for data. The amount of storage and the amount of data that we have doubles. It's called Kreider's Law. It's about every 18 months it doubles. And again, that's not, you know, it's not terribly predictive, shall we say, but historically it's been frighteningly accurate since 1960, or since the early 60s, roughly. So the implication out of this, though, is if you think about what we can do today, in terms of the information that we've got access to, we can have cars that drive themselves. The implication of that is total disruption of massive industry sectors. We can predict someone's likelihood to recommit a particular crime. We can change the nature of logistics in real time for understanding people's purchasing patterns en masse. We can design products that people want without actually having to go through the large-scale engineering effort, as long as you have a reasonable sample pool to begin with. So the idea of continuous improvement based on customer feedback. What's a focus group in that context? You just work out what people want by mining the information and building it. So much simpler. And that's today, with the information we have now. And in another 3 years, we're going to have double that, roughly. So that kind of takes me close to the end. I mentioned 3 other things that I don't have answers to yet, but which I think I find tremendously interesting. First one is data science as a general thing. I think we've all done, and this is not the fault of anyone in this room or anyone anywhere, but the whole hubbub and hype around data scientists has done a tremendous disservice to everyone. The amount of mind space and mind share that gets wasted debating what a data scientist is completely and utterly pointless. The other side is too, it's inhibiting most organizations that I know because they're trying to find people who just quite simply don't exist. You know, they're trying to find the people who have the perfect communication skills, the programming skills, the knowledge of Scala, MapReduce, SAS, R, everything under the sun in that one person. And it's creating a tremendous amount of confusion. The reality is, I think it's groups of people. You know, it's not any one person, it's understanding how to build the right sets of people. So I think, personally, that the whole concept of data science won't go away, but the whole definition of a data scientist will increasingly seem a little bit silly. The second thing, which these are the 2 really, to me, interesting ones. The first one is privacy. And how do you manage privacy in a world where information is open, available, transportable, and eminently hackable? And no one has an answer for this. This is the obvious one, and this is where a lot of the interesting conversations I have at the moment. This is the obvious one, which is around how do you secure that information. And that's a valid thing. I don't know if anyone's seen, but apparently someone, I won't hazard a guess as to which country, but someone has apparently released the world's first Trojan horse for iPhones that gives people access to, gives unknown people access to people's messages, contact lists, and everything else. And somehow it's shown up in Hong Kong for whole protesters. Anyone been seeing this? So I'm not going to guess who developed it. That would be imprudent of me. But, you know, in a world where all of this information is increasingly going into the cloud, how do you actually make sure that it's secure and private? That's kind of the first one, which is interesting, and no one really has an answer to it yet. The second one, which I think is more interesting, which is more from the regulatory perspective, is what are the implications of having an overly strong privacy regime? Because if you look at even Australia's innovation rankings, Australia's innovation rankings are very, very low relative to the US and other countries around the world. And it's one of the interesting questions is how much of innovation is stifled by not being able to innovate in the use of information when information is creating so much disruption and innovation elsewhere. And again, I don't have an answer to that, but it's an interesting question. The last one, which is where I think we're going to see a huge change over the next few years, is what does information ownership mean over the next 5 to 10 years? Because the whole idea, my hunch and my feeling is that information ownership is again going to become increasingly archaic. The idea that if I interact with a bank, as an example, or a telco, and I do things with them, the idea that they own that information about me seems a little bit strange. Because what happens if I want to take my risk profile and my behavioral information and take it across to another insurer so they actually don't have to ask me any questions, but they can just basically accurately price my risk? I have an interest in that information. Obviously, my current provider has a strong interest in that information, and they have responsibilities for that information. But what does information ownership mean in that sort of context, where information starts powering everything? And additionally, where information actually has tangible value in many ways. At a personal level, I mean, the interesting one was he priced Facebook when they floated, and based on the number of customers, I think each customer was worth about $5 or $6, which probably sounds about right to me. You know, the information, all my information, I don't use Facebook, but all of my information, all my personal photos and everything else that they know about me, probably sounds about $5, sounds about right. I'm kind of bored. But in aggregate, that information is worth a lot of money. And people, you know, people today are very willing to trade that information for value in some way. You know, people happily give Facebook all of their information because they get value for it. So even though it's not a financial transaction, that information has worth. And again, we don't have a framework, either a conceptual or regulatory or legislative framework to be able to explain how to make information portable based on what people want to do with it. The interesting stuff at the moment, if you look across Europe at the moment, some of the countries are trying to make efforts to make information, make it mandatory for companies to expose information, as an example. So if you want to know everything that Facebook knows about you, you can make a request and they have to give you all of that information, any personally identifiable information. Interesting questions. So that kind of takes me to the end. And I've got, not too bad for timing.